Emanuel Swedenborg, the mystic who bridged heaven and earth. Of all the men and women whom the world has classed under the general title of mystic, not one certainly occupies so singular a position as Emanuel Swedenborg. If we decide to accept the world's verdict, and it seems difficult to do otherwise, and agree to call Swedenborg a mystic, we are confronted by the fact that we can find no parallel either to his personality or to his career, though we search the role of the mystics of all the ages. Pascal indeed was, like Swedenborg, a master mathematician and a man of wide general learning, but he was a mystic first and foremost, and his life from an early date was given up to his calling as a leading light of the Catholic Church. Swedenborg, on the other hand, was, until the age of 50, a man of science and a man of affairs. That is, he was a scientist of the most eminently practical kind, one whose encyclopedic knowledge was turned always into utilitarian channels, and for whom knowledge of any kind appeared to have no meaning outside its practical application. It would be difficult to instance a single one of the world's great men whose interests were so wide, or whose mental activity was so all-absorbing. Outside art, there seemed literally nothing that did not appeal to him as a field for his indefatigable investigation, and, as regards art, it was presumably its lack of utilitarian value which led to its neglect by his essentially practical mentality. Swedenborg started his travels in the first years of early manhood, and wherever they took him there was nothing which escaped his observant eye. To whatever part of Europe he went, it would seem that he could not be satisfied without learning all that was to be learnt, without seeing all that was to be seen. When he establishes himself in London, he does not merely take lodgings because the price is reasonable, or because the cooking is good, or because he thinks he will be comfortable. He writes from London in 1711, "I turn my lodgings to some use and change them often. At first I was at a watchmaker's, and now I'm at a mathematical instrument maker's. From them I steal their trades, which some day will be of use to me." At Leyden he learnt to grind glass for lenses, so that he might furnish himself with appliances which he could not afford to buy. His brother wishes for globes for the university at Uppsala. These proved too expensive, and he was asked to purchase printed maps which might be mounted in Sweden. The makers would not supply these, so Swedenborg applied himself to learning engraving and prepared them himself. When chafing at enforced inactivity at home, he turns his attention to music and writes to his brother-in-law that he has been able several times to take the place of the organist. In traveling on the continent, he studies the fortifications of the towns, the methods of constructing fences. He visits and investigates all the manufactories. He passes critical remarks with regard to the blast furnaces, the vitriol, arsenic and sulfur works, the copper and tin manufactories, the paper mills, and studies also the methods of mining. Not content with this, he investigates the social conditions of the people, criticizes the situation of affairs in France, the wealth of the church, and the poverty of the people. "Everywhere," he says, "the convents, churches, and monks are the wealthiest and possess most land. The monks are fat, puffed up, and prosperous. A whole proud army might be formed of them without their being missed." Again, "The houses are miserable, the convents magnificent, the people poor and wretched." He investigates the problem of the revenue of the French government, obtained by the system of taxation called tithing. It amounts, he says, to some 32 million livres, and Paris, on account of its rents, contributes nearly 2/3 of the sum. "I am told," he says, "that the ecclesiastical order possesses 1/5 of all the property in the state, and that the country will be ruined if this goes on much longer." He gives the number of convents in France, actually at that date between 14 and 15,000, the number of the members of the religious orders, the number of the abbesses, prioresses, chapters, etc. He goes to hear the celebrated preachers, among them the king's chaplain, who gesticulates like an actor. He discusses the adoration of saints with an abbé. He visits the hospitals and attends the opening of Parliament. Not content with this, he frequents the opera and the theatres, and passes opinions upon the most popular pieces and the most distinguished actors and actresses. In the midst of all this, we find him speculating on the form of the particles of the atmosphere and writing an introductory essay to a book which he is planning to prove that the soul of wisdom is the knowledge and acknowledgement of the Supreme Being. As if this were not enough, he occupies his spare moments in the study of anatomy, astronomy, magnetism, and hydrostatics. Surely, since the world began, there was never a more versatile brain. He has even observations to make on military matters. He goes to see the Brandenburg soldiers, Frederick the Great's famous regiment. The men, he says, are tall and slender, and they march erectly. They go through their drills with the greatest promptness and regularity, but their manner is a little theatrical. The whole squadron is like a machine placed there, moving instantaneously at the pleasure of the machinist. If, he says, they displayed the same uniformity in battle as in drill, they would conquer Alexander's army and subject a great part of Europe to Prussia, but he leaves it to the reader to fill in the reason of his doubt. Others besides Swedenborg have possessed that encyclopedic type of brain which amasses vast stores of miscellaneous knowledge, but few, if any, have possessed at the same time Swedenborg's extraordinary capacity for utilizing the knowledge gained and turning it to practical account. The idea of learning as an object in itself was indeed entirely alien to Swedenborg's type of mentality. All information acquired was merely regarded as a means towards some practical end. We thus find him founding universal principles upon the knowledge he has accumulated in explanation of the laws which govern phenomena. We see him, for example, deducing his conclusions in the field of geology from a number of observed facts. He reports on the geological conformation of Sweden and concludes from it that the country was at one time swept over by a sea in a state of great commotion. He notices the fact that the stones on the mountainsides are worn off and rounded in support of this. He also describes the remnants of a wrecked ship excavated far inland and the skeleton of a whale which was discovered in West Gothland. Swedenborg's contributions in the field of geology, says Professor A.G. Nathorst, are of such significance and value that they alone would have been sufficient to have secured him an honored scientific name. As a mining expert, he was unequaled. We should never be able to finish, says Professor Schleiden, if we attempted to enumerate all the improvements which Swedenborg introduced in the working of the mines in his own country. The metallurgical works of this remarkable man, says Dr. Percy, seem to be very imperfectly known, and yet none are in my judgment more worthy of the attention of those interested in the history of metallurgy. The airtight stove which he describes in his work on new observations and discoveries respecting iron and fire, published in 1721, is stated to be identical in principle with one recently patented in Washington. Sir Isaac Newton had propounded the corpuscular theory of light, which was for long universally held. Swedenborg dissented, stating in his Principia that motion diffused from a given center through a contiguous medium or volume of particles of ether produced light. This theory is the one now adopted. Swedenborg also notices that light and electricity are produced by the same efficient cause, thereby supplying the clue to the utilization of electricity as a means of lighting. Even where in the field of science he was looked upon as a dreamer in his own days, his dreams have since taken practical shape. Among the inventions which he projected was the plan of a certain ship which with its men was to go under the surface of the sea wherever it chooses and do great damage to the fleet of the enemy. He also designed a flying machine, a project which he was very reluctant to drop. Christopher Polam, however, threw cold water on this, saying, with respect to flying by artificial means, there is perhaps the same difficulty as in making a perpetuum mobile or gold by artificial means. His philosophy recognizes the synthetical as well as the analytical method as requisite to arrive at true conclusions. Both, he says, are necessary in reflecting upon and tracing out one and the same thing. For in order to do so, there is required both light, a priori, and experience, a posteriori. He who is possessed of scientific knowledge, he says elsewhere, and is merely skilled in experiment, had taken only the first steps in wisdom. For such a person is only acquainted with what is posterior, and is ignorant of what is prior. Thus his wisdom does not extend beyond the working of the senses, and is unconnected with reason, whereas nevertheless true wisdom embraces both. Unquestionably Swedenborg, as he is known to us from the record of the first 50 years of his life, if we accept the earliest years of his childhood, was about the last person one would expect to have his name associated with that Swedenborgian gospel by which eventually it came to be known to the world at large. He had, as we have seen, earned many titles to recognition, but assuredly that of a medium of communication between this world and the world of spirits was not one of them. Swedenborg's father was a Swedish Lutheran bishop with leanings towards pietism, and a rather broader and more sympathetic outlook than the majority of his fellow clergy. His name, Swedenborg, was subsequently changed to Swedenborg when the family was ennobled by the Swedish king. Emanuel was the second son and third child of Bishop Swedenborg and his wife Anna, of whom we know but little and who died when Emanuel was only 8 years old. The child was thus surrounded by religious influences in his early days, and it is said that his father had a guardian angel with whom he claimed to be able to converse on occasion. Reared under these conditions, he naturally enough evinced strongly religious tendencies in his childhood. From my 4th to my 10th year, he says, I was constantly engaged in thought upon God, salvation, and the spiritual experiences of men. I revealed things at which my father and mother wondered, saying that angels must be speaking through me. Here at least we obtain some suggestion of what he eventually became, and of which the intervening years between childhood and middle age seem to afford us little or no hint. The believer in heredity will point to the psychic temperament of the father as inherited by the son, but there appears to be no foreshadowing in his ancestry of that encyclopedic mind with which he was destined to astonish his contemporaries. His father evidently failed to understand his precocious son, and the relations between the two were far from cordial, the son considering that his father was inappreciative and failed to encourage his intellectual activities, and also blaming him for meanness in matters of finance. Bishop Swedenborg had, however, 8 other children besides Emanuel, and very probably he did not find it easy to make 2 ends meet, especially as he was something of an author himself, and published books at his own expense, which proved far from remunerative. Probably the father considered that the son ought to settle down to some regular trade or profession instead of commencing life by traveling in search of knowledge first to one country and then to another. Presumably, he regarded his precocious offspring as likely to become a jack of all trades and master of none, and there are doubtless many other parents who under similar circumstances would have thought the same. In any case, the son was able to start off on his travels, in spite of financial embarrassments and many dangers on the way. He was nearly wrecked when approaching England. Then the ship was boarded by pirates, and on the top of this was fired into by a British guard ship, being mistaken for the pirate craft. Finally, our youthful hero narrowly escaped hanging for breaking the quarantine regulations, the plague at this time being prevalent in Sweden. Under somewhat similar circumstances, the great Julius told the captain of his vessel not to be afraid, as he was carrying Caesar. Whether Swedenborg had any such faith in a providence watching over his future destiny, we are not told. He certainly realized his unique powers, but can hardly have suspected the channel into which they were eventually to be diverted. The one link between Emanuel and his family was his brother-in-law, Eric Benzelius, afterwards bishop, and the sister to whom he was married. In his financial and other troubles, he repeatedly appeals to him for sympathy and practical help, evidently not without response. He also asks for intercession with his father, to whom he obviously did not care to appeal direct, having met with too many rebuffs. It is interesting to note that one of the first objects that met his eyes in London was the magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral, finished a few days ago in all its parts. He makes the acquaintance of Flamsteed, the most notable astronomer in England, who was concerned in the founding of Greenwich Observatory and seems to have been something of an astrologer as well. Apparently, as the result of this visit, he takes up with enthusiasm the study of astronomy. "I have made such progress in it," he says, "as to have discovered much which I think will be useful in its study. Although in the beginning it made my brain ache, yet long speculations are no longer difficult for me. I examined closely all proportions for finding the terrestrial longitude, but could not find a single one. I have therefore originated a method by means of the moon, which is unerring, and I am certain that it is the best which has yet been advanced. In a short time I will inform the Royal Society that I have a proposition to make on this subject, stating my points. I've also discovered many new methods for observing the planets, the moon, and the stars. That which concerns the moon and its parallax, diameter, and inequality I will publish whenever an opportunity arises." He longs to go to Oxford and investigate the Bodleian Library, but cannot, for want of money. "I wonder," he says, "my father does not show greater care for me than to let me live now for more than 16 months upon 250 riksdaler, something under £50. Finally, he returns home and obtains an appointment as Assessor Extraordinary at the State Department of the Board of Mines, which was responsible for the supervision of the great mining industries of Sweden. In this connection, he is fortunate in making the acquaintance of Christopher Polem, the celebrated engineer, who recommends him for his talents and readiness of resource. By degrees, he becomes an intimate guest with Polem's family, a circumstance which leads in the end to a tragic love affair. He falls desperately in love with Polem's younger daughter. The father gives his consent, but the girl, a mere child of 13 or 14, cannot reconcile herself to the idea. Swedenborg, with great sorrow, relinquishes his claim, resolving never again to let his thoughts settle upon any woman. Polem himself seems to have been almost equally distressed with Swedenborg over the incident, especially as it led to a breach between himself and the young man whom he had come to regard in the light of his own son. A period of depression follows, which is accentuated by the death of Charles XII of Sweden, about the same period, from whose encouragement and support Emanuel had considerable expectations. The relations between himself and the king were indeed singularly intimate, Charles readily appreciating the young man's remarkable talents and mathematical knowledge. "Every day," says Swedenborg in writing on September 14, 1718, "I had some mathematical matters for His Majesty, who deigned to be pleased with all of them. When the eclipse took place, I took His Majesty out to see it, and talked much to him about it. This, however, is a mere beginning." In the summer of 1721, Swedenborg started again on his travels, his object this time being to study the mines and manufactories of other countries, so that he might be in a position to render greater services to his own in the office to which he had been appointed. On this occasion he visited all the mines in Saxony and the Harz Mountains, and was royally entertained by Duke Ludwig Rudolf of Brunswick-Lüneburg, who showed him a generosity which he doubtless appreciated after his father's parsimony. Meanwhile, his pen was by no means idle. He published a treatise at Amsterdam on chemistry and physics, some observations on iron and fire, and a work on the construction of docks and dikes, and later on at Leipzig, some miscellaneous observations on geology and mineralogy. On his return home, he settled down again for a period to his work at the Board of Mines, in the meantime gathering matter for further publications, which followed in due course. The most important of these were his Opera Philosophia Mineralia and a treatise on the infinite. The former work met with a very favourable reception, and between one publication and another, Swedenborg soon won for himself a European reputation. The Academy of Sciences at St. Petersburg nominated him a corresponding member, while he was one of the first to be elected for the newly established Royal Academy of Sciences in his own country. Everything thus seemed to open out for Swedenborg a career of great scientific and practical utility. He became, however, gradually led by his philosophical speculations to an investigation of the nature of the soul and its operation in the body, and the mutual relations of the two. This study was the subject of two important works, entitled respectively, The Economy of the Animal Kingdom Considered Anatomically and Philosophically, and The Animal Kingdom Considered Anatomically, Physically, and philosophically. By the animal kingdom must be understood the kingdom presided over by the soul. In the first of these books, Swedenborg deals with the composition of the blood and its circulation, with the heart, arteries and veins, and with the brain and its cortices. In this book, Swedenborg attaches great importance to the blood, for as he says, nothing exists in the body that has not previously existed in the blood. He describes it again as a vital and most spirituous fluid, which has an immediate connection with the soul. In the animal kingdom, Swedenborg describes in full detail all the organs of the body and their uses, the object being in the end to track the soul home and to describe its activities. For as yet, he tells us, her modes of being and her nature are absolutely unknown. Naturally, he recognizes that this will be regarded by the philosophers of his day as a vain and useless quest. But he is prepared to meet their objections with the following pertinent remarks, which, now that the materialistic hypothesis has been finally discarded by the advance guard of modern science, are likely to find a sympathetic echo in scientific as well as philosophic circles. Inasmuch, he says, as the soul is the model, the idea, the first form, the substance, the force and the principle of her organic body, and of all its forces and powers, or what amounts to the same thing, as the organic body is the image and type of its soul, conformed and principled to the whole nature of the soul's efficiency, it follows that the one is represented in the other. Thus, by the body we are instructed respecting the soul, by the soul respecting the body, and by both respecting the truth of the whole. Emerson describes the animal kingdom as an anatomist's account of the human body in the highest style of poetry, and its object as to put science and the soul, long estranged from each other, at one again. It was while continuing his pursuit of this apparently visionary aim that Swedenborg quite unexpectedly found himself, as he believed, in touch with another than the physical world. It was while continuing his pursuit of this apparently visionary aim that Swedenborg quite unexpectedly found himself, as he believed, in touch with another than the physical world. In writing of this extraordinary development in his life history, in the introduction to the Arcana Coelestia, the first volume of which appeared in 1749, he gives his own account of his relationship with the spiritual realm in justification of the remarkably dogmatic statements contained in the book in question. It is, he says, expedient here to premise that of the Lord's divine mercy it has been granted me now for several years to be constantly and uninterruptedly in company with spirits and angels, hearing them converse with each other and conversing with them. Hence, it has been permitted me to hear and see things in another life which are astonishing, and which have never before come to the knowledge of any man, nor entered into his imagination. I have thus been instructed concerning different kinds of spirits and the state of souls after death, concerning hell, or the lamentable state of the unfaithful, concerning heaven, or the most happy state of the faithful, and particularly concerning the doctrine of faith which is acknowledged throughout all heaven, on which subjects, by the divine mercy of the Lord, more will be said in the following pages. With regard to the extraordinary transformation which these experiences brought about in his life's work, he explains to a friend that the Lord has elected him for this mission, for revealing the spiritual meaning of the sacred scriptures which he had promised to the prophets and in the book of Revelation. My purpose previously, he adds, had been to explore nature, chemistry, and the sciences of mining and anatomy. The basis of Swedenborg's teaching, which, under the circumstances, he did not claim as original, was that the Bible must be accepted absolutely as a divinely inspired book, but must be interpreted allegorically. Thus, where historical events are recorded, they are not recorded for the sake of history, for the object of the Scriptures is not to treat of the kingdoms of the earth, but of the kingdom of God. In other parts of the Bible, as in Genesis, there is no truth in the story from the historical point of view. The record is merely an allegory of the soul. His doctrine of correspondences was the recognition of this allegorical relationship between the spiritual and the material. The universe, according to Swedenborg, is symbolical throughout. All material things are derived from their spiritual archetypes and are representations of these. The bodily form represents the spiritual character, for the spirit forms the body in its own likeness. A man's acts are thus the outcome of his inward nature, and there is consequently a correspondence between them and the inward man. The basis of these ideas is, of course, the ancient occult teaching that the universe is the macrocosm and man the microcosm. Thus, Swedenborg tells us that as there is a material sun, moon, and stars, so each of these heavenly bodies has its mental and spiritual counterpart. Swedenborg's doctrine of degrees appears to follow naturally from his doctrine of correspondences. The 3 degrees of the human mind correspond to the 3 kingdoms of nature: animal, vegetable, and mineral, corresponding to spirit, soul, and body. Degrees, Swedenborg tells us, are of 2 kinds: discrete and continuous. All things, from least to greatest, in both the spiritual and natural worlds, coexist at once from discrete and continuous degrees. In respect of discrete degrees, there can be no intercourse between either by continuity. It follows, therefore, that the degrees of the human mind, the celestial, spiritual, and the natural, cannot communicate under normal conditions one with another. Thus, too, men on earth can have no sensible communication with the spiritual world, or see things of that world without a special opening of the spiritual sight. Elsewhere, Swedenborg tells us, to the intent that anything may be perfect, it must be distinguished into 3 degrees. The ground and reason of this is because there must be end, cause, and effect. Another doctrine of Swedenborg's was that of regeneration. In order to be partaker of the higher life, man, he held, must be born again. But this regeneration was not a single event of any particular date, but a continuous process. One of the orthodox doctrines which Swedenborg attacked was that of the Trinity. He denied that Jesus Christ was merely the second person of a divine Trinity. He cites St. Paul's statement that, "In him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily," and maintains that the whole Trinity is centered in his person. In consequence, he says, of separating the divine Trinity into 3 persons, each of which is declared to be God and Lord, a sort of frenzy has infected the whole system of theology, as well as the Christian church so called from its divine founder. That a trinity of gods occupies the minds of Christians, although they deny it from shame, is very evident from the ingenuity of many who contrive methods to prove that 3 are 1 and 1 3 by geometry, arithmetic, and physics. Others have trifled with the divine trinity as jugglers play one with another. Their juggling on this subject may be compared to those sick of a fever who see a single object, such as a man, a table, or a candle, as 3, or 3 as 1. As the orthodox doctrine of the Trinity was false, argued Swedenborg, and there were no 3 persons as supposed, it was, of course, impossible for one of them, the Son, to offer himself as sacrifice to appease the wrath of another, the Father. The doctrine of the atonement, therefore, as taught by the Church, had no basis in fact. God needed no reconciliation to his creatures. It was they who needed to be reconciled to him before they could be fitted to appear in his presence. Christ took upon himself human nature that he might conquer mankind's spiritual enemies, which were keeping him in bondage and estranged from his divine source. One of Swedenborg's most astounding statements had reference to the Last Judgment. This was not, he maintained, the final consummation of all things. The event was an occurrence in the spiritual sphere which actually took place in the year 1757. It appears from his account that in the intermediate state so many undesirable and evil spiritual entities had accumulated that they were threatening the whole world with imminent catastrophe. It may be remembered in this connection that in Swedenborg's time skepticism was everywhere rampant and that religious life had reached its lowest ebb. This was the case not only on the continent but preeminently in England, where the movement headed by John Wesley led to such remarkable scenes in connection with the great spiritual revival which followed this period of religious apathy. To avert the catastrophe threatened to the world, according to Swedenborg's theory, a general judgment was executed upon the spirits who were in revolt and were imperiling the divine order. These powers of evil were at that date placed under restraint, so that an influx of new spiritual forces among men might be made possible. Swedenborg actually goes so far as to affirm that he himself was permitted to witness this judgment in fulfillment of the prophecies made in the Gospels and in the Book of Revelation. The Swedenborgian teaching, which has come in probably for most criticism, is that with regard to marriage, Swedenborg insisted that sex is a spiritual as well as a physical distinction. He denied the virtues of celibacy and declared that true chastity resides in the perfect marriage relation. Marriage, according to Swedenborg, is not a physical relationship till death part the united pair, but is eternal in its character. Conjugal love, being the central and fundamental love of man's life, is also the source of his fullest joy. The delights of the true conjugal love exceed the delights of all other loves. All delights that are felt by man proceed from love, and it follows, therefore, that the principal happiness in the celestial life must have a similar source, and the highest joy of heaven must therefore be the spiritual counterpart of the conjugal life of earth. It does not, of course, necessarily follow from this that earthly marriages are perpetuated in heaven. If the feelings of the marriage partners towards one another are concordant and sympathetic, they continue indeed their married life. But if they are discordant and antipathetic, they dissolve it. For true conjugal love is the only possible form of marriage in heaven, and as their love lasts to eternity, it follows that the wife becomes more and more a wife, and the husband more and more a husband. The true reason of this is that in a marriage of truly conjugal love, each married partner becomes continually a more interior man. For that love opens the interiors of their minds, and in the proportion in which these are opened, the man becomes more and more a man. Swedenborg has some very beautiful observations with regard to the rejuvenescence of those who have passed into the higher life. All who come into heaven, he says, return into their vernal youth and remain so to eternity. The more thousands of years they live, the more beautiful and happy is the spring to which they attain. In a word, to grow old in heaven is to grow young. They who live in the chaste life of marriage are above all others in the order and form of heaven after death. Their beauty, therefore, is surpassing, and the flower of their youth endures forever. What are we to say of this man who propounded this amazing gospel as a direct message from the highest spheres? What are we to say of his communications and conversations with the unseen world? Of his bona fides, it is impossible to entertain a doubt. The ordinary hypothesis is that he suffered from hallucinations. It has been argued, on the other hand, that for a man so sane and so shrewd in the ordinary affairs of the world, hallucinations of the kind were an impossibility. This, however, seems going rather too far. Some of the sanest men in the world have had special points on which they were not mentally sound. Monomania is a recognized form of mental aberration, and the man who suffers from it is as sane as his fellows on all matters except one. This spiritual communion, however, was continuous in the case of Swedenborg for many years, and during those years occupied either in itself or in the activities that arose from it the larger portion of his life. In spite of this absorption, his relations with his fellow men continued as sane and responsible as those of any of his neighbors. Would this have been possible, one may ask, in the face of so absorbing an interest, had this interest merely been founded on a monomania? It would, I think, be difficult to parallel such a case. If, however, we decide to take Swedenborg's relations with the other world at his own valuation, are we called upon to accept his gospel at his own valuation on that account? Certainly not. Swedenborg's estimate of the status of the spiritual beings with whom he communicated, even if we accept their reality, need not be ours. Recent investigations and records of innumerable psychic experiences have tended to show what a miscellaneous crowd of spirits hover around the confines of this material world. Swedenborg's mistake has been made by many spiritualists of the present day, and sometimes with disastrous results. Swedenborg had not before him the evidence which we now hold to warn him of the necessity of testing the quality of his spiritual communicants. The experiences encountered overwhelmed him by their unexpected and apparently miraculous character, and his naturally sane judgment was at fault for want of a criterion by which to estimate them. Few of those who now accept the genuineness of psychical phenomena are prepared to question Swedenborg's exceptional mediumistic powers. To allow them to their fullest extent is by no means to accept the doctrine which was preached through his mediumship. Of Swedenborg's psychic gifts, there is indeed plenty of evidence quite outside the teachings of his celestial visitors. On one occasion, he disclosed to the Queen of Sweden a secret that had existed between her and her deceased brother, the Crown Prince Augustus William of Prussia, which was unknown to any living person. On another, he described to a whole company of people at Gothenburg a destructive fire which had broken out at that very moment in Stockholm. Again, on another occasion, he revealed to the widow of Monsieur de Marteville the hiding place of a missing receipt for money which had been paid by her husband, the Dutch ambassador at Stockholm. These incidents are among the best authenticated of any extant historical records of a psychic character. The philosopher Kant, among others, made a searching investigation into the evidence on which they rested, and came away absolutely convinced of their truth. It is curious to note that John Wesley was not a little interested in the Swedenborgian propagandism. The great Methodist preacher was impressed with a strong desire to meet the Swedish seer, a desire to which, however, he had never given open expression. The Reverend Samuel Smith, one of Wesley's preachers, records how, about the end of February 1772, he was in attendance upon John Wesley when the latter received a communication as follows from Swedenborg, who was then in London, which he read aloud: "Great Bath Street, Great Bath Fields. Sir, I have been informed in the world of spirits that you have a strong desire to converse with me. I shall be happy to see you if you will favour me with a visit. I am, sir, your humble servant, Emanuel Swedenborg." Mr. Wesley wrote in reply that he was then on the point of starting for a 6-month journey, but would be pleased to wait on Swedenborg after his return to London. Swedenborg replied that the visit proposed by Wesley would be too late, as he, Swedenborg, would enter the world of spirits on the 29th day of the next month, never more to return, a prediction which proved perfectly correct. Other men have written many books. It is Swedenborg's unique distinction, if distinction it is, to be the one man in history who has written a library on his own account. The encyclopedic brain does not, as a rule, tend to perspicuity in style, and Swedenborg has suffered from neglect owing to the fact that the fertility of his genius was not sufficiently associated with the powers of selection and condensation. To search for the treasures of his knowledge among his published works is like looking, in the words of the hackneyed proverb, for needles in a haystack. Had he given us far less in volume, the world would doubtless have profited more by the very valuable information contained in his writings. There are times when one is inclined to regret, if also to feel thankfulness, that Swedenborg was sidetracked by his celestials, and that he did not complete his phenomenal career on the lines which he had marked out for himself. It is a vain, though alluring speculation, to consider how the destinies of nations might have evolved if certain incidents in a single life history had eventuated otherwise than they did. We may conceive of Swedenborg bringing to completion his schemes for the construction of flying machines and submarines nearly 2 centuries earlier than was decreed by destiny, and ask ourselves, if we will, what use the great Napoleon might not have made of these formidable implements of destructive warfare, and how far the map of Europe, and indeed of the world, might have been changed through their employment by his formidable genius. Or again, to what extent the linking up of the new and old worlds might have been accelerated by such developments. Here, at least, we must admit was a phenomenon, a man who realized, in a measure undreamed of by his contemporaries, not only in the physical but also in the spiritual sphere, the stupendous possibilities of the coming time.